Hey, Steve Saretsky here. As always, Canadian real estate market update with a particular focus on Vancouver. For getting sort of value entertainment out of these videos, I'll ask that you hit thumbs up and subscribe. Questions, comments, put those below. I want to touch this week on a lot of questions I'm getting bombarded with, and particularly a lot of smart individuals as well reaching out to me, money managers, for example, saying, hey, like what's going on in the housing market? Seems like, detached houses are flying off the shelves. Thought I was going to be able to lowball this summer. Deepest recession since the Great Depression. But yet, these houses are getting bid up, and so I kind of want to touch on that because I think it's important. Stan Druckenmiller, probably one of the most respected investors kind of this generation, has the famous quote, and I think it is very much indicative of today's environment. And that quote is that liquidity drives markets, not the real economy. And this is a result of really just the massive intervention from central banks over the years, is that basically the real economy has become detached from financial markets. So, all we have to do is look today and say, okay, you have, the deepest recession since, again, the Great Depression in Canada, the US, globally. But yet you have, stock markets rallying, and some sectors hitting new all-time highs. You have housing markets, not just in Vancouver, not just in Toronto, not just, parts of Canada, but like in the US, red hot. These markets are red hot. So again, all these kind of financial markets moving kind of, in unison and lockstep together because of the liquidity that is being provided to markets. And all you have to do is really look at money supply growth, which is up, I believe, by about 30% this year, which is essentially central banks, again, explicitly devaluing the fiat currency, right? So that's kind of the real essence. And I'm trying to help kind of people understand this phenomenon. Because as we can see here, again, in Canada, for the latest GDP in May, so, we're starting to see some increases, but even with May and June, which is projected to be about a 5% increase in growth of GDP, Q2 of 2020 in Canada, for example, should be the steepest drawdown since the Great Depression. Okay, so you have that. That's the real economy. People hurting, lost jobs, white collar jobs now being impacted, still seeing layoffs, people struggling to get back to work. So the real economy is quite literally broken. But then again, you have now financial markets. We can look at the Bank of Canada's balance sheet, which is Bank of Canada's buying $5 billion worth of bonds every single week. $5 billion of the bonds. That's actually greater. That is greater than the net issuance of the federal government on basically, if you analyze that, that's going to be greater than the federal government's net issuance of bonds. So basically what that means is the central bank is effectively soaping up all the bonds that the federal government is issuing, and they are basically the primary buyer of these bonds. So basically they're funding essentially the government's deficits. So again, everybody wants to talk about higher taxes, how are we going to pay for these deficits? No, they're not going to get paid. It doesn't matter how much you want to tax the rich. That's not going to pay this deficit. The central bank is going to explicitly just buy the government debt and then stroke a check and say you are forgiven. Similar to where the road that Japan is going down, the Bank of Japan, where they own the vast majority of the entire government bond market. So that's where it's going. Now, don't get me wrong, I think a tax is coming on the wealthy, more just from a political standpoint, because you have this massive growing wealth inequality, and central banks, in my opinion, their policy measures are to blame for this massive wealth inequality. So there was an article written by Yahoo Finance, I believe it was Stephanie Hughes, Twitter friend there. She posted this chart. So this basically shows the sum of wealth in Canada across households, where you can see that the vast majority is in real estate. That's where everybody's wealth is tied up. And so you kind of have this Ponzi where you have to kind of keep it going now, because it's become such a large component of the economy, where if you allow that significant contraction to happen, everything kind of breaks down and falls apart on itself. But it's funny because you see stuff like that, and then CMHC Sadal coming out again saying, oh, this dreamboat home ownership's going to be turned into a nightmare. And while he may be true that this could become destabilizing, it's ironic because these are the same kind of decisions and policymakers that that are coming out and saying this thing. Oh, too much debt, and we need to kind of slow it down. And these guys are the ones that are in control of that. So the Bank of Canada's come out and said, oh, household debt's a vulnerability. And then you have Tiff Macklem come out like 2 weeks ago and say, oh, Canadians, you need to borrow more money. Like, we need to get through this. We're going to lower interest rates and put them on the floor for the next several years. Don't worry about it. And then you have, CMHC coming out with the Insured Mortgage Purchase Program, which is effectively taking mortgages off the bank's balance sheet to allow them to continue to lend into the real estate market. So that kind of supports the housing market price-wise. So it's like all these policy measures that they put in place are effectively designed to keep the asset prices high, yet they're complaining about the wealth inequality that it's creating. So you can see this kind of catch-22 that is just so blatantly obvious to anyone that's paying attention. Unfortunately, and it's become clearer and clearer to my attention, that the 99% of Canadians, or 99% of, whatever, people in society in general, don't actually understand really a central bank or the policies that they're creating and what they actually do to the real economy. Because I posted this chart on Twitter, which shows the Bank of Canada's accumulation of Canada mortgage bonds. So they've 30x'd their holdings of Canada mortgage bonds since COVID. So this program is essentially non-existent. They started implementing a little bit last year. They've now 30x'd their holdings of Canada mortgage bonds. So essentially what this does, this is the simplistic dumbed down version. I might do a longer version in another video, kind of an explainer. But for now, basically what you need to know is essentially this is a liquidity provision for banks. So what this does is it helps kind of banks take those mortgages kind of off their books. It packages them into a bond, and then the Bank of Canada basically buys that bond. So what this does is it helps create liquidity for the banks. It keeps interest rates from increasing, from rising, because obviously, if you start increasing the supply of mortgage bonds to the general market, and the general market looks and says, wow, we have an economic catastrophe on our hands, this is not going to be good for the housing market. So what does that mean? That means bond prices will start to fall and the yields will go up. And so if you have yields on, say, Canada mortgage bonds rising, that's going to result in funding pressures for the banks. That means higher mortgage rates for you. So instead of paying 2% today, you probably would have been paying 4%. And obviously that would have been a disaster for the housing market. So what does that mean? That means the Bank of Canada comes in and basically becomes the primary buyer of these Canada mortgage bonds. So they basically come in, they use their, call it what you want, use their printing press to buy these bonds, suppress the yield down, and keep the market functioning as they want it. So this is why you have a housing market today that is still very, in my opinion, quite strong, considering that this is the worst economic contraction since the Great Depression. Now again, will they be able to keep this charade up? Is anybody's guess. But clearly, these are the kind of policies that nobody talks about, the media doesn't talk about, because truth of the matter is it's a complicated subject, and they just prefer that you mind your own business and not ask any questions. But these are the true drivers of wealth inequality. Forget talking about housing supply and not building enough condos. These are the kind of policies that make housing unaffordable for the average person that is working a 9-to-5 income and trying to keep up with these policy measures that are essentially devaluing the worth of your income. and allowing asset prices to continue to expand exponentially. So that's kind of thoughts for this week. Again, I'll probably do an explainer video on this whole mortgage securitization machine and how these Canada mortgage bonds really kind of play out. But the simplistic version of what you need to understand is that liquidity right now is driving markets, not the real economy. Central banks seem determined to keep that up. Hence why I always say you cannot predict markets, because you cannot predict the extreme, in my opinion, disgusting policies that some of these central banks are implementing. Again, you can argue some of it might be needed. Certainly nobody wants a depression on their hands, but at the same time, you have to understand, again, as I've said many times before, for every action, there is a reaction. There are consequences for these types of policies, and the consequences, as I've been very vocal about, are going to be massive wealth inequality. You have a bull market in social unrest that will continue, and I don't think that you've seen even close to the end of this. This is only just beginning, and I think that you'll see more fringe politics as we move through this phenomenon. So I hope that brought some value or entertainment to you. Give me some YouTube juice, thumbs up, subscribe. Again, we'll try to do more of an in-depth video on the whole securitization process. But for now, that's all you need to know. See ya.